A single day that drew Swiss banking institutions into the orbit of Balkan geopolitics for the first time in modern history. A single day that forced NATO's most senior commanders to cancel scheduled leave and return to Brussels before dawn. What Kosovo's government did today crossed a line that European mediators had hoped would hold, at least through the summer, at least through the German elections, at least long enough for the diplomatic track to find its footing again. And when that line broke, neither Zurich nor Tirana hesitated. They responded with speed, with coordination, and with a level of institutional resolve that caught even seasoned observers off guard. For nearly 18 months now, there had been signals, that not official communiques, not formal intelligence briefings distributed to allied capitals, just signals, that Pristina was preparing something that did not fit the pattern of its previous provocations. Kosovo's government has been assertive, yes, but they have been methodical in their assertiveness. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a choreography: diplomatic statement, security posture adjustment, border incident, international condemnation, tactical retreat, repeat. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Vienna this spring was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor the Western Balkans know the indicators: the volume of cross-border telecommunications traffic between Pristina and Tirana, the movement of reserve-grade military equipment out of southern Albanian depots, the frequency of encrypted communications between Kosovo's Interior Ministry and the Albanian Prime Minister's office, the sudden disappearance of key Kosovo security force commanders from their publicly listed duty stations. All of that went quiet simultaneously in the 72 hours before today's events. And whenever Pristina goes quiet in that particular way, it means something is about to get very loud. Regional analysts had flagged this pattern to at least 3 European foreign ministries. Whether those warnings reached the right desks in time is a question that parliamentary committees will be asking for months. But as of this morning, the question of whether something was coming became irrelevant because it had already arrived. Early Tuesday morning, European Union monitoring mission personnel deployed near the Ibar River detected what they described as a coordinated movement of Kosovo security force units, including armored personnel carriers that had not been mobilized in over 4 years. These are the kinds of assets that Pristina only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a demonstration of force, a territorial assertion, or a full operational push into the contested northern municipalities. EU monitors on the ground didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 simultaneously. But what they did know was that Kosovo was changing its posture in the north with a decisiveness that departed entirely from established protocol. And when a government shifts military posture without notification, without the standard pre-movement communications to KFOR, even by the smallest tactical measure, every monitoring authority in the region pays immediate attention. By 6:40 in the morning, Serbian government sources were already describing what they called an armed incursion into northern Mitrovica. Kosovo's Ministry of Internal Affairs issued a counterstatement within the hour describing the operation as a law enforcement action targeting criminal networks operating under Serbian state protection. But the scale of the deployment, confirmed by satellite imagery circulated among European defense ministries before noon, was not consistent with a law enforcement operation. It was consistent with something much larger, and Zurich, of all places, noticed first. The decision issued by Switzerland's Financial Market Supervisory Authority, FINMA, tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior financial compliance officers briefed by FINMA after an emergency convening this afternoon described the agency's directive as unprecedented in scope, extraordinary in speed, and, perhaps most importantly, deliberate in its targeting of specific account categories linked to political and paramilitary structures in the Western Balkans. Switzerland does not move like this casually. Zurich's financial sector has navigated conflicts on its periphery for generations without invoking emergency asset freeze protocols. The last time FINMA moved with anything approaching this velocity was during the early stages of the 2022 sanctions cascade following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But that process took days. Today's action took hours. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the initial military movement reports reaching Swiss financial intelligence channels, FINMA issued a temporary freeze directive covering accounts identified as connected to Kosovo security force procurement networks, Albanian state-adjacent financial entities, and at least one major holding company whose beneficial ownership traces back to figures in Tirana's governing coalition. These weren't precautionary holds applied through routine monitoring. These were targeted intelligence-led asset freezes, financial instruments that FINMA only deploys when it is preparing to feed information into a broader international sanctions architecture or when it is signaling to allied financial authorities that the legal groundwork for coordinated action is already being laid. The message from Zurich was clear. Whatever is happening on the ground in northern Kosovo today, its financial architecture will not be permitted to function freely. Tonight, multiple European security sources confirmed that Albanian Special Forces units launched cross-border movements into Kosovo's northwest corridor, including through at least one mountain passage that had recently been quietly upgraded. What analysts believe was preparation for exactly this kind of rapid deployment. Albanian forces moved before Serbian counter-mobilization could establish blocking positions. They secured the Bistrica junction. They secured high ground positions overlooking the main K4 resupply route. They established forward presence at 3 additional locations that were almost certainly being prepared to support Kosovo's interior advance from the west. In other words, Albania targeted the flanks. The operational architecture that would have allowed Serbian security forces to encircle Kosovo security force units in the north before international monitors could intervene. The component that would have made a Serbian counter-operation logistically viable. And that is precisely what made the EU monitoring mission's morning warning so urgent. Kosovo's advance into northern Mitrovica wasn't just a show of political will. It was operationally timed to coincide with Albanian flank security. It represented the kind of coordinated two-axis movement that could decisively alter ground realities before international bodies could convene an emergency response, if left unchecked for even a matter of days. And Albania, understanding the window fully, moved with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the kind of precision that suggested this plan had been rehearsed, revised, and rehearsed again. They didn't target Serbian civilian infrastructure. They didn't advance toward Belgrade-administered territory. They hit strategic choke points. They hit overwatch positions, and they held. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Kosovo's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of the EU-Serbia normalization dialogue after months of increasingly visible fractures within the European diplomatic coalition. Pristina wanted to see whether Brussels would issue a strong, unified condemnation or whether the familiar divisions between member states with different Balkans interests would produce the kind of diluted, carefully worded response that emboldens rather than deters. But instead, something different happened. The EU didn't fracture. FINMA didn't wait for political consensus. And NATO's Supreme Headquarters issued a statement within 6 hours that was, by the standards of alliance language, remarkably direct. You don't get that kind of rapid institutional alignment easily. But today, Kosovo and Albania produced it by moving in a way that was decisive enough and coordinated enough to make ambiguity politically untenable for European governments. Regional security analysts speaking with European media under conditions of anonymity described Pristina's strategic calculus as a form of constructive irreversibility, a deliberate attempt to create facts on the ground that are faster to consolidate than to reverse diplomatically. But the response today proved that Europe's institutional reflexes, while slower than Pristina may have anticipated, remain both intact and consequential. The FINMA directive was not only legally grounded, it was issued so precisely that it reached the accounts of the relevant network before end of business in Zurich, before money could be moved, before structures could be reorganized. That timing matters enormously because it demonstrates that Swiss financial intelligence and EU security channels are sharing information in something approaching real time on Balkans-related risk. It shows that Pristina is not operating in a permissive financial environment. They are operating under active surveillance, financial, military, and diplomatic, simultaneously. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon and evening, we learned more about the full scale of today's coordinated action. Kosovo security force units carried out structured advances along 3 separate northern axes, forcing K4 peacekeepers to activate emergency liaison protocols and deploy additional observation teams to monitor contact lines. Albanian Special Forces targeted at least 2 Serbian Interior Ministry forward observation posts that had been reinforced in the last 60 days, reinforcements that intelligence sources describe as preparation for exactly the kind of contingency that materialized today. Unmanned aerial vehicles operating over the Ibar Valley reportedly conducted what appears to be battle damage assessment flights used by Kosovo's command structure to evaluate the effectiveness of early phase movements. This wasn't just a border incident. This wasn't just another cycle of provocation and managed tension. This was coordinated operational planning. This was strategic synchronization between two governments acting in concert, and strategic synchronization is the one capability that Serbia's government and its European backers have consistently underestimated since the 2008 Kosovo Independence Declaration. For every diplomatic setback Kosovo has absorbed since then, Pristina and Tirana have quietly closed the capability gap between what they can do politically and what they can do in the field. And today, that gap closed entirely. Remember, Serbian officials thought that Kosovo's international support would erode over time as EU enlargement fatigue deepened. They thought that Albania's government would never risk a direct military entanglement that could jeopardize its own EU accession process. They thought that Switzerland, landlocked, neutral, commercially pragmatic, would never insert its financial architecture into a Balkans crisis in a way that carried real economic consequences. But tonight, the exact opposite is unfolding. Kosovo's international support, whatever its complications, has not prevented Pristina from acting with operational confidence. Albania has chosen its alignment openly, visibly, and at measurable diplomatic cost, which means Tirana calculated that the cost of inaction was higher. And Zurich has moved faster and harder than anyone anticipated, signaling that the financial containment architecture around this conflict is more robust than Pristina or Belgrade had modeled. 3 miscalculations, all revealing themselves in a single day. What makes this moment so volatile and so dangerous is that Kosovo's advance happened at a time when Prime Minister Kurti is facing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Domestic nationalist constituencies want visible progress on the northern municipalities and will accept nothing short of permanent administrative integration. Diaspora financial networks want a demonstration that Kosovo's government is acting from strength, not perpetually negotiating under duress. EU integration partners want compliance with Brussels-brokered agreements that Kurti's government has repeatedly described as unworkable, and Washington, whose posture on the Balkans has shifted considerably, wants regional stability without being drawn into a direct mediating role that carries domestic political costs. Kurti is balancing these demands while managing the daily pressures of governing a young state with limited institutional depth and a security apparatus that was built for a different kind of threat environment than the one it now faces. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves at scale, they are not doing it from strength. They are doing it from accumulated pressure. They are doing it because the cost of continued restraint has, in their internal calculation, finally exceeded the cost of action. That is one of the most dangerous states a government can be in. Because pressure-driven decisions move faster than diplomatic systems were designed to process. The EU High Representative's statement, now distributed to all 27 member state foreign ministries and forwarded to the UN Secretary General's office, was designed to signal that Brussels is not willing to accept a unilateral redrawing of administrative realities in northern Kosovo through force. Senior EU officials said plainly that Kosovo's security force deployment was inconsistent with the obligations undertaken under the Brussels Agreement and subsequent dialogue frameworks. That is careful, layered diplomatic language for, we consider this a material breach, we are documenting it formally, and we are not going to let it pass without consequence. You don't usually hear that precise combination of terms from the EU's diplomatic machinery unless the internal political consensus to act, not merely to issue statements, is already forming. Multiple member state ambassadors speaking on background confirmed that an emergency session of the Political and Security Committee is being convened tomorrow morning. That committee does not meet in emergency session for symbolic reasons. Meanwhile, Kosovo's Prime Minister Albin Kurti addressed the nation in a composed, deliberate, and notably unrepentant televised address tonight. He said, "The rule of law in the North is not a negotiating position. It is a constitutional obligation, and we have fulfilled it." He said, "Those who built parallel structures to undermine Kosovo's sovereignty were warned. They were warned through dialogue. They were warned through legal processes. Tonight they have been warned through action." And he said, "Albania stands with Kosovo not because we ask them to, but because free nations recognize each other, and they stand together." These are not rhetorical flourishes designed for domestic consumption only. These are statements from a head of government who understands that he has just crossed a threshold from which there is no procedural retreat, only forward movement or international containment. And he appears to have made his calculation about which of those he can live with. Here's what makes the situation even more complex and dangerous than the immediate headlines suggest. Kosovo's northern advance was not an isolated operation. Along with the primary security force movement, Serbian paramilitary-linked formations in Bosnia increased their communication activity in the 6 hours following the Mitrovica reports, in a pattern consistent with mobilization signaling rather than routine operations. Russian Foreign Ministry spokespersons convened an unscheduled press briefing in Moscow this evening, indicating that the Kremlin intends to insert itself into the framing of this crisis at the UN Security Council level, likely as early as tomorrow morning. Certain media networks affiliated with Hungarian government-linked entities dramatically amplified Serbian government framing of the events within hours, in what information analysts describe as a coordinated narrative operation designed to shape European public opinion before the facts were fully established. All of this happened within the same 12-hour window. When a regional crisis activates simultaneous military, financial, diplomatic, and information responses across multiple actors simultaneously, it means something larger is underway than any single government's decision. It means a structural confrontation that has been building for years has found its triggering moment. Analysts in Brussels, Vienna, and Washington are now actively considering several distinct scenarios for what comes next. One is that Kosovo is preparing to consolidate control of northern Mitrovica and its surrounding municipalities rapidly, establishing administrative facts before international pressure can force a withdrawal, and then use that consolidated position as leverage in future status negotiations. Another possibility is that Pristina is attempting to force Serbia into a military response that would discredit Belgrade internationally and dramatically accelerate Kosovo's remaining recognition agenda among states that have so far withheld formal acknowledgement of its independence. A third scenario, the one worrying European security officials most acutely, is that Kosovo and Albania are attempting to fundamentally alter the geographic and political architecture of the Western Balkans in a single sustained operation, betting that the international community's response will be slow enough, divided enough, and ultimately pragmatic enough to accept the outcome rather than reverse it by force. But today, FINMA's asset freeze took one card off the table. Pristina did not anticipate that Switzerland would move this fast. They did not anticipate that the financial architecture surrounding their operation would be targeted within hours rather than days. They did not anticipate that Zurich's intervention would create the kind of immediate liquidity pressure on affiliated networks that makes sustained operational financing significantly more difficult. They moved, and the financial world moved back faster. What we are watching now is a test of institutional speed. Kosovo wants to see whether it can consolidate the north before the international response achieves the cohesion necessary to impose real costs. The EU wants to show that its diplomatic architecture, the Brussels Agreement, the dialogue framework, the monitoring mission, retains functional authority even when a party to the agreement decides to act outside it unilaterally. NATO wants to prevent this crisis from becoming the kind of precedent that invites similar unilateral actions elsewhere in Europe's contested periphery. And the alliance is acutely aware that the precedent being set tonight is being watched in capitals far beyond the Balkans. And Serbia wants to prevent the permanent loss of administrative presence in the north without triggering a military confrontation that its own security forces are not positioned to win and that its international partners, Russia included, cannot practically rescue it from. 4 actors, 4 objectives, none of them fully compatible, all of them active simultaneously. Tonight, we have heard from EU monitoring mission personnel who are now conducting continuous overnight reporting to Brussels headquarters. They say the situation on the ground in northern Mitrovica remains tense, but has not yet escalated to direct armed confrontation between Kosovo security force units and Serbian Interior Ministry personnel. They say Albanian forces have not advanced beyond the initial positions established this morning, suggesting either a deliberate operational pause or a period of consolidation before the next phase. And they say Kosovo's decision to conduct this operation without prior notification to KFOR or EU monitoring structures is likely part of a broader deterrent strategy intended to demonstrate that Pristina is no longer willing to pre-clear its security operations through international channels, a posture shift with profound implications for the entire peacekeeping architecture in the region. But Europe is not paralyzed. In fact, Europe is mobilizing faster than it has on any Balkans issue in years. The FINMA directive, NATO's rapid statement, the emergency PSC session, the EU High Representative's formal breach notification, taken together, these responses sent a message to Pristina that the international environment is less permissive than its strategic planning assumed. And they sent a message to Belgrade that Europe's response, while not military, is structured, coordinated, and designed to impose sustained costs rather than simply express disapproval. As this night continues and the next day approaches, we expect more details to emerge about the full operational scope of what Kosovo and Albania have set in motion. But what we already know is that Europe's institutional response, led unexpectedly by Zurich's financial regulators and backed by Brussels' diplomatic machinery, was timely in a way that matters. It contained the financial oxygen available to the operation before it could be fully established. It created an international paper trail documenting the breach before any post facto narrative management could obscure it, and it signaled to every government watching this crisis that the era of consequence-free unilateralism in the Western Balkans, if it ever truly existed, is over. What happens next will depend substantially on what Pristina decides in the next 48 to 72 hours. If Kosovo pauses its advance and signals willingness to return to dialogue from its new position, this moment may be remembered as a calculated provocation that achieved its territorial objective at manageable diplomatic cost, a Balkans version of the kind of fait accompli that has reshaped European borders before. If Kosovo pushes further north, Europe and NATO have already demonstrated tonight that they are not only watching, they are ready to respond across financial, diplomatic, and potentially security dimensions simultaneously, and the architecture for coordinated escalating pressure is already operational. And tonight, for the first time in years, Pristina appears to be genuinely uncertain. The northern corridor is quieter than it was this morning, too quiet. Albanian positions have not moved in 6 hours. And when Kosovo and Albania go quiet after a move like today's, it means they are calculating. It means they are measuring the distance between where they are and where the international community's tolerance ends. It means they are choosing their next step with the kind of care that only comes when you realize the response was stronger than you modeled. Because tonight, Pristina learned something that every government which has tested European institutional resolve in the post-Cold War era has eventually discovered: that the EU moves slowly until it doesn't, that Switzerland stays neutral until its financial system is weaponized, and then it moves with extraordinary precision, and that NATO speaks carefully until it speaks finally. This story is far from over. The next 72 hours will determine whether today is remembered as the opening of a new Balkans crisis or as the day a long-building confrontation finally found its shape and was met firmly before it could fully harden into something irreversible. But tonight, 3 things are already clear. The Western Balkans are no longer a managed, slow-burning problem. They are an active, fast-moving crisis. The financial world, beginning in Zurich, has entered this conflict in ways that will outlast any ceasefire negotiated on the ground. And the governments involved in Pristina, in Tirana, in Belgrade, and in Brussels are all now operating without the comfortable ambiguity that has defined Balkans diplomacy for a generation. The lines are drawn, the assets are frozen, and we will be here tracking every development, every communique, every movement report and financial filing as the next phase of this crisis unfolds.